Welcome to The Last Watch. Jack Anderson, a seasoned police chief, arrives in the quiet town of Bright Falls, expecting a fresh start. But instead, he finds a place ruled by intimidation and secrecy. The local officers don't take kindly to Jack's ideas of accountability, and the townspeople seem fearful of anyone who dares challenge the status quo. As Jack begins to unravel the truth, he faces resistance from every side. Yet, his quiet determination to bring trust and integrity back to Bright Falls slowly ignites a transformation no one saw coming. But can he really change a town so set in its ways? If you're drawn to stories of resilience and community, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Can one person truly make a difference? Let's dive into The Last Watch. Jack Anderson had driven over 20 hours to reach the town of Bright Falls, his new home. Or at least, that was the plan. The transition from his long-held city post to a chief of police role in this rural southern town felt surreal, even as he crossed the state line into South Carolina. For months, he debated this move, pondering whether leaving behind 30 years of urban police work was worth the trade-off for the slower pace, the quieter streets. But his bones felt older than his 55 years, and the bustling city life had taken more out of him than he liked to admit. As he approached the edge of town, the road narrowed, and tall pines lined his view. The canopy overhead cast long shadows across the road, a reminder that in Bright Falls, nature always seemed closer than in the steel jungle he'd left behind. He passed a sign proclaiming, "Welcome to Bright Falls, a town with heart." Beneath the cheery words, a smaller plaque read, EST 1872. The town looked timeless, as if it hadn't changed since it was founded. Jack lowered his window and took a breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. It was refreshing, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes and stale city smells that had been his daily backdrop. He wondered if he'd finally find peace here, or if Bright Falls would chew him up and spit him out just like every other place he'd tried to settle. The closer he got to the town center, the more he noticed people watching him. Small groups stood chatting on sidewalks, but each turned to study his car as he passed. Their gazes lingered, brows furrowing slightly, and Jack felt a subtle tension behind their curiosity. He guessed newcomers weren't common in a place like this, where generations probably lived in the same houses, attended the same schools, and knew everyone's business before it even happened. He pulled into the parking lot of a small diner at the edge of town. It looked like the kind of place where you could order a decent coffee and a hot meal for under $10 and maybe catch the latest town gossip while you were at it. Above the door, a neon sign flashed Daisy's Diner, buzzing slightly in the early morning air. The paint on the sign was peeling, but it seemed to suit the place, charming in its imperfections. Jack stepped out of his car, stretching his legs, and felt the eyes on him again. Across the lot, a few locals were leaning against their trucks, sipping coffee out of styrofoam cups. One of them, an older man with a grizzled beard and worn cap, nudged his companion and nodded in Jack's direction. Jack nodded politely back, but their stares didn't waver, as if they were studying him, assessing him for whatever reason. Ignoring the scrutiny, he walked into the diner. The smell of frying bacon, brewed coffee, and syrup filled the small space, making Jack's stomach growl. He hadn't eaten since he'd left the interstate, figuring he'd stop when he got closer to Bright Falls. The diner was quiet, the kind of quiet that made him painfully aware of each step he took. Heads turned, just as they had outside, with several pairs of eyes following him as he slid into a booth near the counter. He nodded to the waitress, a woman in her late 40s with graying hair pulled back into a ponytail. She approached him with a warm, practiced smile. "What'll it be, hon?" "Just coffee for now, thanks," Jack replied, offering a polite smile. She poured the coffee with a steady hand, her eyes flicking up to meet his as she asked, "You new in town? Don't think I've seen you around here before." "Just got in," he replied, lifting the cup to his lips. "I'm Jack." She nodded, her smile fading just slightly. "Well, welcome to Bright Falls, Jack. Hope you find what you're looking for." He couldn't tell if it was a friendly sentiment or a subtle warning. Jack decided to keep the conversation light, mentioning that he'd come for work, though he left out the specifics of his new role. He figured he'd ease into that revelation later. He wanted to observe first to get a sense of this place on his own terms. As he sipped his coffee, He noticed two police officers seated at the corner booth near the door. One was tall and wiry, with blonde hair combed back and a slight smirk on his face. The other was stocky and broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close and a watchful, sharp gaze. Their badges gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights, and even as they talked, Jack could feel their attention on him, subtle but unmistakable. Their conversation paused every now and then, and each time, one or both of them would glance his way. Jack met their eyes once, and the tall one, Ethan, offered a nod that was barely polite. Jack nodded back, returning to his coffee. He knew he'd deal with these two soon enough, but for now, he was content to let them think he was just another outsider passing through. He finished his coffee, left a tip on the table, and rose to leave. Just as he reached the door, he heard a voice call out, casual but pointed. "Hey, old man, you lost." Jack turned, keeping his face neutral as he looked back at the tall officer. "Just passing through," he replied evenly. The officer smirked, exchanging a look with his partner. "Well, keep passing," he said with a grin. "Strangers don't last long around here." Jack offered a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Good to know." As he walked out, he could feel their stares on his back, and he knew without a doubt that he'd be seeing them again. Jack took the long way back to his rented house, driving through various neighborhoods and taking in the character of the town. Bright Falls had a charm to it, with its neat houses, white picket fences, and sprawling yards. But there was also something else, a sense of something lurking just beneath the surface, a tension that was hard to place. He saw it in the quick glances of the people he passed, the way some of them avoided his eyes as if they were afraid of what he might see. Once he was back at the house, he unpacked slowly, letting his mind wander over his first impressions. He wasn't sure yet what to make of Bright Falls, but he knew he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. It was more than the usual apprehension of a new place. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Later that day, he took another walk around town, stopping in at a few stores and chatting briefly with the shop owners. Most were polite, though a bit reserved. It wasn't until he met Sarah Lewis, the editor of the town's newspaper, that he felt he'd made a genuine connection. Sarah was in her late 30s, with a sharp mind and a quiet confidence that seemed out of place in a town like Bright Falls. She greeted Jack warmly, though her gaze held a flicker of curiosity. "So, Chief Anderson," she said, leaning against the counter of the bookstore they'd both wandered into. "What brings you to Bright Falls?" "Needed a change of pace," Jack replied. "Thought a small town might be quieter." Sarah chuckled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Quieter, maybe, but Bright Falls has its own way of doing things. People don't always take kindly to change here." Jack nodded, sensing an undercurrent to her words. "Is that so?" She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just keep your head down, Chief. Bright Falls isn't as straightforward as it seems." Jack wanted to press her, but she turned the conversation to lighter topics, leaving him with more questions than answers. He had a feeling she knew more than she was letting on, but for now, he'd respect her discretion. He was a stranger here, and he'd have to earn her trust if he wanted answers. Over the next few days, Jack went through the motions of settling in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he walked through town, he noticed the quick, appraising looks from locals, the way conversations seemed to hush when he approached. It was as if the entire town was waiting for him to make a wrong move. He spent most of his first week familiarizing himself with the department, meeting with officers, and taking inventory of the town's issues. His instincts told him to observe before acting, to understand the dynamics before he made any changes. But the tension between him and Ethan and Ron, the two officers from the diner, was palpable. They were always polite in his presence, but Jack could feel their resistance, a simmering hostility that they didn't bother to hide. He caught snippets of conversations, rumors about past incidents that had been brushed under the rug, incidents that painted a picture of a department that operated more like a fraternity than a law enforcement agency. Jack knew it would take time to gain the trust of his team, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the warning signs. The longer he stayed, the more he noticed a pattern. Whispers of people who had left town after crossing the line, rumors of public shaming and intimidation tactics that seemed to target anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Jack's unease grew, but he kept his observations to himself, knowing that he'd need concrete evidence before he could take action. The weather was mild the next day, and Jack decided to explore more of the town on foot. He'd seen the main street with its handful of shops and the diner, but he wanted to get a sense of the neighborhoods and back roads, the places not immediately visible to a newcomer. He believed that walking through a place, observing it quietly, revealed more about it than any formal tour could. Besides, he wanted to let Bright Falls get used to him. He was their new chief, after all, and they'd need time to adjust just as much as he would. As he strolled through town, nodding at passersby, he noticed again that not all his nods were returned. Some people seemed too eager to avoid eye contact, stepping aside or crossing the street to avoid coming too close. Others gave him brief, tense glances, as though sizing him up before turning away. Jack's gut told him it wasn't the usual small-town suspicion of outsiders. There was something deeper, something almost fearful. Jack's thoughts wandered to the two officers he'd encountered in the diner, Ethan and Ron. The way they'd looked at him, the casual confidence, the subtle threats. It wasn't just that they were dismissive. It was as if they'd already decided he was an unwelcome presence. That kind of attitude didn't form overnight. It was cultivated, and Jack suspected that they'd been used to handling things their way for a long time. He would need to figure out how deep their influence ran. Turning a corner, Jack spotted a small, fenced-in playground. A handful of children played on the swings and jungle gym, while a few parents sat on benches nearby, watching with quiet smiles. One of the parents, a young woman with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, noticed him and gave a polite wave. Jack waved back, feeling a glimmer of relief at the friendly gesture. He walked over, introducing himself. "Nice to meet you. I'm Jack Anderson, new to town." The woman gave a friendly smile. "Oh, you're the new chief, aren't you? I'm Marla. I run the little bookstore down on Maple." "Good to meet you, Marla. Lovely town you've got here." She hesitated, her smile faltering just slightly. "Yes, it is," she replied, though her tone suggested there was more she wasn't saying. She glanced around, as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping, before adding quietly, "I hope you'll find it peaceful." Jack noted her choice of words and the subtle caution in her eyes. He decided to press, gently. "Peaceful is just what I'm looking for. But I can't help but notice folks around here seem reserved." Marla gave a small sigh, looking down at her hands. "It's just, well, things don't change much here. Most people are used to things being a certain way, and new faces, they don't always get an easy welcome." She paused, biting her lip as if debating whether to continue. Jack waited, his silence encouraging her to go on. After a moment, she looked back up. "Look, Chief, just watch out for some of the folks around here. Most people are good, but there are some who've been here forever, and they don't like change. Especially people who think they can make a difference." Jack sensed a mix of caution and sincerity in her words. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Thanks, Marla. I appreciate the heads up." She nodded, glancing over her shoulder before giving him a parting smile. "Well, if you're ever in the mood for a book, you know where to find me." "Good luck, Chief." As Jack watched her walk away, he couldn't help but feel a subtle chill. Her words, while vague, seemed to hint at something lurking beneath the surface, a cautionary tale unspoken. The following morning, Jack had his first formal meeting with Mayor Charlotte Price. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a keen intellect and a calm, unwavering gaze that spoke of years spent managing town politics. Her office was lined with bookshelves filled with town records, history books, and framed certificates, a collection that suggested both pride and vigilance over Bright Falls' legacy. "Welcome to Bright Falls, Chief Anderson," she said, extending a hand with a smile that was friendly but controlled. "I hope the town's treated you well so far." Jack shook her hand, matching her polite smile. "It's been interesting, I'll say that much." The mayor gave a slight chuckle, her eyes twinkling. "Bright Falls is a unique place, no doubt about it. Folks here value tradition, and they can be slow to trust newcomers, especially in law enforcement." Jack nodded, studying her expression. "I've gathered that. It's a close-knit community, Isn't it? Very much so, she replied, leaning back in her chair. Most families have been here for generations. They know each other's business and look out for each other. That loyalty runs deep, Chief. People here take care of their own. Jack hesitated, then ventured. And what about those who aren't considered their own? A shadow flickered across her face. Gone so quickly Jack almost missed it. We welcome everyone here, Chief, she said carefully, but her tone held a trace of something Jack couldn't quite place. But, as with any small town, it's easier for those who fit in. He decided not to press her, sensing that she wasn't likely to give him a straight answer. Instead, he shifted gears, keeping the conversation light. They discussed his plan for the department, the issues he'd be focusing on, and the mayor's expectations for his role. But even as they talked, Jack felt an underlying tension, as if both of them were carefully dancing around an unspoken truth. By the time he left the mayor's office, Jack's unease had only deepened. He was beginning to understand that the town's resistance to change went far beyond small-town skepticism. There were invisible lines here, boundaries that he hadn't yet deciphered. And he had a feeling that crossing those lines would come with consequences. The Bright Falls Police Department was a modest building, with only a few rooms and a handful of officers on duty at any given time. Jack spent his first week shadowing the other officers, getting a feel for the way things operated. He'd always believed in watching and listening before making any changes, and Bright Falls was no exception. The officers under his command were polite, though some were noticeably distant. Ethan and Ron, the two he'd met at the diner, were particularly resistant. They followed orders well enough, but there was an air of insubordination, a sense that they weren't interested in taking him seriously. Jack kept his observations quiet, noting their behavior without challenging it directly. One afternoon, he walked in on Ethan and Ron chatting in the break room. They were laughing about something, their voices low, and Jack caught a snippet of their conversation. Didn't even see it coming, Ethan was saying, chuckling. Thought he could just walk into our town and start making rules. We showed him, all right. Ron grinned, shaking his head. Some people just don't know their place, do they? Jack leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Gentlemen, am I interrupting? The laughter died instantly, and both men straightened, their smiles vanishing. Ethan's expression shifted to a practiced politeness, though his eyes held a hint of defiance. Not at all, Chief. Just discussing some past experiences. Jack held his gaze, letting the silence hang. Good to know you're learning from them. He walked out without another word, leaving the two officers exchanging uneasy glances. Jack knew they'd take his words as a challenge, but he didn't care. If there was one thing he wouldn't tolerate, it was a lack of respect for the badge. He was beginning to suspect that Ethan and Ron had more influence over the department than he'd initially thought, and he'd need to tread carefully. Jack ran into Sarah Lewis again a few days later, this time at the local grocery store. She was reaching for a can on a high shelf, and Jack stepped up to grab it for her. Thanks, Chief, she said with a smile, taking the can from him. You're settling in, I hope? Trying to, he replied, falling into step with her as they walked down the aisle. But it seems like settling in here means adjusting to a lot of unspoken rules. Sarah gave a soft laugh. That's one way of putting it. Bright Falls has its quirks. Quirks or secrets? She hesitated, her smile fading slightly. Both, I guess. Look, Chief, there's a lot I could say, but it might be better if you see things for yourself. Jack raised an eyebrow. You're being awfully cryptic. Sarah shrugged, though her expression was serious. All I can say is keep your eyes open. Not everything in this town is as simple as it looks. They parted ways, but Sarah's words lingered in Jack's mind long after he left the store. He was beginning to feel like he was piecing together a puzzle, each interaction adding a new fragment to the bigger picture. But the picture itself remained frustratingly incomplete, and he had a feeling that whatever it revealed would be far from straightforward. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth as Jack laced up his running shoes. He'd always used morning jogs to clear his mind, to center himself before a long day. Today, he needed it more than ever. The undercurrents in Bright Falls had been stirring more than he liked to admit, and no matter how he tried to blend in, It seemed the town was intent on keeping him at arm's length. His quiet inquiries and observations had only heightened the locals' wariness, and he could feel the watchful eyes on him whenever he walked down Main Street. As he jogged along a dirt path on the outskirts of town, he could hear the steady crunch of gravel beneath his feet and the rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. The routine was comforting, giving him a brief respite from the questions constantly churning in his mind. But soon enough, the hum of an engine interrupted his thoughts, growing louder as it approached. Jack glanced over his shoulder, spotting a patrol car creeping up behind him, its headlights flashing in the morning mist. He didn't need to see the faces inside to know it was Ethan and Ron. He'd become all too familiar with their taunting smiles and condescending remarks. His instincts told him to keep his pace, to ignore them and carry on, but he knew that would only encourage them. As the car pulled alongside him, Ethan leaned out of the driver's side window, his smirk just as smug as ever. "Morning, runner. You lost." Jack slowed to a jog, keeping his expression neutral. "Just going for a run. Pretty sure that's allowed." Ethan chuckled, glancing at Ron, who sat in the passenger seat with a grin. "Allow, maybe, but welcome? Well, that's another story, isn't it, Ron?" Ron snorted in agreement, his gaze sharp as he looked Jack up and down. "Strangers don't usually make it long around here, especially not ones who think they can just change things." Jack stopped, turning to face them fully. He kept his voice steady, refusing to let them see any hint of irritation. "I'm here to keep the peace. Nothing more, nothing less." Ethan's smile faded, and his tone turned harder. "Keeping the peace, huh? Well, Chief, you ought to know that peace looks a little different around here." Without another word, Ethan opened his door and stepped out, striding over to Jack. Ron followed, the two of them flanking him like wolves circling prey. Jack remained still, his mind already calculating his next move. He'd dealt with officers like these before, men who let power go to their heads, who believed their badges gave them the right to enforce their own twisted version of the law. Ethan patted Jack down, his movements rough and invasive. Jack could feel the tension coiled within himself, the urge to push back building. But he held steady, knowing that any reaction would only give them the justification they were looking for. Ethan pulled out a crumpled receipt from Jack's pocket, holding it up like it was evidence of some crime. Well, look what we have here," he sneered, waving the receipt mockingly. "Guess we got ourselves a big city lit-a-bug." Jack met Ethan's gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's from my coffee this morning. I was planning on throwing it away." Ron snickered. "Sure you were, Chief. Your city types are all the same, thinking you're better than the rest of us." Jack let the words roll off him, keeping his calm. He'd encountered countless officers with chips on their shoulders, men who resented authority even while they wore it on their sleeves. But these two were different. They didn't just want to intimidate him. They wanted to put on a show, to make an example of him. Before Jack could respond, the two officers grabbed him by the arms, their grip ironclad as they began leading him down the dirt road. He didn't resist, knowing that any struggle would only escalate things. They marched him toward the town square, their smug expressions barely concealing the satisfaction they took in this public display of power. The square was quiet when they arrived, with a few early risers milling about, going through their morning routines. Jack felt the stares of the townspeople as Ethan and Ron pulled him to the center of the square, right beneath the old lamppost that stood like a silent sentinel over the town. As they secured his hands around the post, making a show of tying him in place, Jack could feel his frustration simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just a power play. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate and degrade him. Ethan cleared his throat, looking around at the gathering crowd with a smug grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "We've got ourselves a real troublemaker here." Ron joined in, his grin matching Ethan's. "Yep, thinks he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, or maybe in his pockets." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, though some people looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Jack scanned the faces, noting those who seemed entertained, those who seemed indifferent, and those who looked disturbed. He'd learned to read crowds long ago, and he could see the faint flickers of sympathy in a few eyes, a recognition of injustice, even if they were too afraid to act on it. Phones appeared in people's hands, recording the scene from different angles. Jack knew this footage would likely end up online, another viral story of small-town power gone wrong. But he didn't care about his reputation. He cared about what this display said about Bright Falls. If the town's officers were willing to humiliate him, their own chief, in broad daylight, what else were they capable of? Ethan strutted around, reveling in the attention. He leaned in close to Jack, his voice a low murmur meant only for him. Thought you could just walk in here and make us play by your rules, didn't you? Well, welcome to Bright Falls, Chief. We take care of our own here. Jack held his gaze, his voice calm and steady. If this is how you treat your own, Ethan, maybe it's time for a change. Ethan's smirk faltered for a split second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he quickly recovered, laughing and turning back to the crowd, as if Jack's words had been nothing more than a joke. They left Jack tied to the lamppost for what felt like hours, though it was likely no more than 45 minutes. The crowd eventually dispersed, though a few lingered, watching with uneasy glances. Jack remained silent, his expression resolute. He refused to let them see the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. When they finally untied him, Ethan clapped him on the shoulder with a mocking grin. "Welcome to Bright Falls, Chief. Hope you enjoy your stay." Jack said nothing, brushing off his sleeves and meeting Ethan's gaze with a level stare. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his back straight and his jaw set. He could feel the weight of the stairs on him as he made his way back to his car, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the next morning, the video clips from the lamppost incident were everywhere. Jack's phone buzzed with notifications, messages from friends and former colleagues who had seen the footage and reached out in shock and outrage. The story had gained traction online, with viewers from across the country expressing outrage at the officer's behavior. Jack sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through the comments. The messages ranged from words of support to calls for justice, with many demanding that the officers be held accountable for their actions. Jack felt a sense of vindication as he read the responses. The public outrage was validating, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his sense of injustice. Later that morning, he made his way to the station, his uniform crisp and his demeanor calm. He could feel the tension in the air as he entered, his colleagues watching him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Jack nodded at them, keeping his expression neutral as he made his way to his office. It wasn't long before Ethan and Ron walked in, laughing and joking as they usually did. Their laughter died instantly when they saw Jack seated at his desk, his gaze fixed on them with an intensity that made the room feel colder. "Good morning, gentlemen," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, their smug expressions faltering as they realized the gravity of the situation. Jack could see the hint of fear in their eyes, the dawning understanding that they might have finally crossed a line they couldn't walk back from. He stood, his gaze steady as he addressed them. "Let's have a chat about your behavior, shall we?" Jack took a long, slow walk back to his rented house, the humiliation of being tied to that lamp post still stinging in his chest. He'd endured taunts and slights before, but this felt different. It was public, deliberate, and meant to undermine any authority he had. As he walked through the quieter residential streets, a few people looked his way, their expressions a mix of sympathy and unease. Others quickly glanced away, as though acknowledging him might invite trouble upon themselves. As he rounded the corner near his home, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, half expecting Ethan or Ron, but instead saw Sarah Lewis hurrying to catch up. She gave him a brief, tight smile, her brow furrowed in concern. "Chief Anderson," she said quietly, coming to a stop beside him. "I saw what happened." "Everyone did." Jack returned her gaze, seeing genuine worry in her eyes. "Did they now?" Sarah nodded, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "Videos of it are all over social media. People are already talking. Even if most folks here are used to certain things, what they did to you, that's not sitting right with a lot of people." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. I knew this place had its own ways, but I didn't expect the welcome committee to be so theatrical. Bright Falls isn't what it looks like on the surface, Sarah replied, her tone grim. There's a reason people are afraid to speak out. I've been reporting on this town for years, and every time someone tries to shake things up, they're shut down. Sometimes quietly, sometimes not so much. Jack studied her for a moment, her words hinting at a backstory she hadn't shared yet. And you? How are you still here? Sarah's eyes flickered with a mix of determination and resignation. I keep a low profile, stick to writing stories that don't rock the boat too much. But I keep records, notes, and I know a lot more than I let on. Jack nodded, appreciating her discretion. I'll be careful then. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. You're not alone in this, Chief. There are people in this town who want change. They're just waiting for someone strong enough to lead the way. Her words gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that this fight wasn't just about his reputation or authority. It was about dismantling the culture of fear and intimidation that had taken root in Bright Falls. As Sarah turned to leave, Jack felt the faintest glimmer of hope, knowing he had at least one ally. The following days were quiet, though Jack could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Ethan and Ron kept a low profile, and most of the other officers gave Jack a wide berth, as if unsure how to navigate the aftermath of the incident. Jack took it in stride, spending his time in the office reviewing old case files and slowly familiarizing himself with the department's history. He made a point to avoid any immediate confrontations. Instead, he let the silence do the talking, observing his team and making mental notes of those who seemed complicit in the town's traditions and those who kept their distance from Ethan and Ron. He could feel the officer's unease whenever he walked through the station. His silence, he knew, was making them more nervous than any reprimand would have. One afternoon, he spotted Officer Claire Thompson, one of the younger members of the force, sitting in the break room. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening with a mixture of apprehension and sympathy. "Chief," she greeted him, her voice tentative. "Claire, right?" Jack said, sitting down across from her. She nodded, looking down at her hands. Jack kept his tone casual, unthreatening. "I appreciate you keeping a level head. I've noticed you don't seem to be as close to some of the other officers." Claire hesitated, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was listening. I don't want to get involved with all that. I came here hoping to do good work, to make a difference. But it's harder than I thought it would be." Jack gave her a reassuring nod. "You're not the only one feeling that way. I've got a feeling there are more like us. Sometimes change just needs a nudge." Claire looked up, her expression softening. "If there's anything I can do, let me know. I want things to be better here too." As he left the break room, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He now had a few quiet allies, and even if they were hesitant to act openly, he could feel the shift starting. The first cracks were beginning to appear in the facade of the department's so-called traditions. Not long after his conversation with Claire, Jack received an invitation from the town council to attend their monthly meeting. He knew the request likely stemmed from the recent controversy and the council's growing concerns about the department's public image. It was the perfect opportunity for Jack to quietly assert his authority and signal that he wasn't going anywhere. The council meeting was held in the old town hall, a building that echoed the town's history with its wood-paneled walls and dusty photographs of past mayors. Jack took a seat near the front, nodding politely to the council members, most of whom gave him curt nods in return. The atmosphere was tense, the members shifting uncomfortably as the meeting began. Mayor Charlotte Price cleared her throat, casting Jack a measured look. "Chief Anderson, thank you for attending. We wanted to address recent events and the attention they've brought to Bright Falls." Jack inclined his head. "Of course, I'd like nothing more than to see our department represent this town with the respect it deserves." Councilman George McCauley, a stout man with a gruff demeanor, frowned as he leaned forward. "We appreciate that, Chief, but things have run a certain way here for years. People in this town are used to a certain stability." Jack met his gaze calmly, choosing his words carefully. Stability is important, but stability doesn't mean condoning behavior that undermines public trust. If we want the people of Bright Falls to respect the law, then our officers must embody that respect. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of agreement and reluctance. Jack sensed their discomfort. Many of them had likely benefited from the culture that Ethan and Ron upheld. But the tide was shifting, and they could see it as clearly as he could. Mayor Price cleared her throat, her voice softer. "We understand your perspective, Chief, and will support any measures you believe are necessary to maintain the department's integrity." Jack gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. The meeting continued on with formalities and updates on local projects. But Jack knew the real work would happen afterward, in the way people looked at him, the way they whispered among themselves. He'd planted the seed, and now he needed to let it take root. Word of the council meeting spread quickly through the department, and Jack could sense the shift in the air. Officers like Claire seemed emboldened, giving him nods of support as he walked past. Even those who had previously kept their distance seemed to watch him with a newfound respect. Ethan and Ron, however, remained noticeably absent, keeping a low profile since their public display. Jack continued his quiet campaign of observation, gathering evidence without making any overt moves. He was careful not to give Ethan or Ron any reason to feel cornered. He wanted them to believe he was letting things slide, that he was too intimidated to challenge them outright. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they pushed back, before their pride got the better of them. One evening, as Jack was closing up at the station, he found a note slipped under his office door. It was written in hurried, shaky handwriting and signed. "They've done worse to people here. People who won't speak up. They think they're untouchable. But we know. Some of us see what you're doing, Chief. Keep going." Jack stared at the note, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. He carefully folded it, slipping it into his desk drawer. This was the confirmation he'd been waiting for, proof that people were watching, that they wanted change as much as he did. The quiet days that followed were tense, filled with an uneasy calm as Jack continued to bide his time. Ethan and Ron's absence from the station grew more conspicuous, and Jack knew they were likely plotting their next move. He could feel the storm brewing, the inevitable confrontation that would force them to reveal their true colors. But he wasn't afraid. He'd waited long enough, and he had the patience to see this through. Late one afternoon, he was out for another run, this time on a secluded trail near the edge of town. He kept his pace steady, his thoughts focused on the evidence he'd gathered, the allies he'd quietly won over. His footsteps were rhythmic, grounding him in the moment. He knew he needed to stay sharp, to be ready for whatever Ethan and Ron had planned next. As he rounded a bend, he spotted a figure standing near the trail, waiting. He slowed, his instincts flaring as he recognized Ethan's tall, wiry frame. The officer's expression was one of barely concealed resentment, his eyes cold as he watched Jack approach. "Chief," Ethan said, his voice laced with a false politeness. "Out for another run? I see." Jack stopped, meeting his gaze steadily. "Just getting to know the town, officer." Ethan's smirk faded, and he took a step closer. "This is our town, Anderson, and we're not about to let an outsider change that." Jack felt the weight of Ethan's words, the challenge clear. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he gave Ethan a calm, unwavering look, his voice steady. "We'll see about that." As the days passed, Jack noticed that Ethan and Ron seemed to be keeping their distance. Their absence was strategic, a kind of power play intended to undermine his authority, but Jack was ready. He had spent his entire career navigating complex personalities within the force, and he knew that a show of silent strength would send a stronger message than confrontation. One morning, Jack received a memo from Mayor Price's office, inviting him to address the town council and provide an update on his department's direction. Jack sensed this was more than a mere formality. The recent social media fallout from the lamppost incident had stirred up attention from local news outlets, and there were murmurs about Bright Falls' unique ways making headlines statewide. Jack prepared for the meeting carefully. He knew that his approach to this presentation would set the tone for his leadership in the eyes of the council and the townspeople. On the day of the meeting, he donned his full uniform, his badge polished and his demeanor resolute. He had a vision for Bright Falls, one built on trust and transparency, and he would make that clear today. The council meeting took place in the town hall, a sturdy brick building with tall windows and creaky wooden floors. Jack stepped into the room, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him. Some were friendly, others skeptical, but all were watching him closely. Mayor Price gave him a welcoming nod as he took his seat. "Chief Anderson," she said, her voice carrying a tone of formality, "thank you for joining us. I believe it's time we discuss the current state of the department." Jack inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, council members, for this opportunity." He launched into his presentation, outlining his goals for the department: increased community outreach, greater transparency in law enforcement, and an unwavering commitment to ethical conduct. His words were met with a range of reactions. Some members nodded in approval, while others shifted uncomfortably. But Jack kept his tone calm and steady, making it clear that his vision was non-negotiable. Councilman McCauley, who was known for his bluntness, leaned forward, eyeing Jack with a challenging expression. "Chief, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is Bright Falls. Things have been working just fine here for generations. We don't need anyone coming in and upsetting the balance." Jack held McCauley's gaze, refusing to back down. "Councilman, I respect this town's history, but respect for tradition doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to misconduct. Law enforcement should be about protecting and serving all residents, not instilling fear." A murmur rippled through the room, and Jack noticed Mayor Price watching him intently. She'd been a politician long enough to recognize the undercurrents of change, and Jack could tell she was weighing her options. Finally, Mayor Price spoke, her tone measured. "Thank you, Chief Anderson. Your commitment is noted, and we look forward to seeing how you plan to integrate these values into the department." The meeting adjourned shortly after, and as Jack left, he could feel the shift in the council members' attitudes. Whether they supported him or not, they'd receive his message loud and clear. Back at the station, Jack's stance in the council meeting had not gone unnoticed. Officers who'd previously been wary now watched him with a newfound respect, their curiosity piqued by his calm yet assertive leadership. Officer Claire Thompson approached him that afternoon, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "Chief, I just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're doing. I think a lot of us do." Jack gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Claire. I know change isn't easy, but we're stronger as a team. I want this department to be a place we can all be proud of." She smiled, clearly encouraged, before returning to her work. Jack felt a small sense of victory. He was beginning to build trust, one ally at a time. Later that week, Jack organized a training session on community engagement, something that had been overlooked in the department for years. He framed it as an opportunity for the team to learn more about connecting with residents, but he knew it was more than that. It was a way to quietly signal to Ethan and Ron that their influence was weakening, that the department was moving in a new direction. Jack kept the session interactive, encouraging the officers to share their thoughts on community relations. To his satisfaction, a few officers opened up, discussing ways to improve their approach. Even the more skeptical officers couldn't ignore the positive energy that emerged from the conversation. Jack felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing he was planting seeds of change that could eventually reshape the entire department. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Ethan and Ron's displeasure was obvious. Their resentment simmered, their glares sharper than ever. They were careful to maintain a veneer of professionalism in Jack's presence, but the tension was undeniable. One evening, as Jack was locking up his office, he found a note slid under his door, typed and unsigned. "Bright Falls doesn't need saving. If you know what's good for you, you'll remember who really runs things here." Jack stared at the note, feeling the weight of its threat. He knew it had to be from Ethan or Ron or perhaps one of their supporters in the community. But the message was clear. His efforts to change the department weren't going unnoticed, and there were those who would fight to maintain the old ways. He slipped the note into his desk drawer, his jaw set with determination. This only reinforced his resolve. He wouldn't back down, not now, not when he was beginning to see the impact of his leadership. By the end of the month, Jack had quietly amassed a small but significant group of supporters, both within the department and among the townspeople. Sarah continued to write subtle articles hinting at the need for transparency and ethical law enforcement, her words carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations while still nudging the public toward awareness. Jack had also begun compiling evidence of past misconduct. Old complaints against Ethan and Ron, incidents of intimidation, vague threats, and cases where charges were mysteriously dropped had been quietly documented over the years, but never addressed. Jack carefully reviewed each one, making sure he understood the depth of their misconduct. Then, one morning, he received a call from Mayor Price's office, notifying him that a group of reporters had arrived in town, seeking interviews regarding the recent viral footage of the lamppost incident. Jack knew this was his moment to set things in motion. The reporters gathered outside the station, cameras rolling, microphones ready. Jack stepped out to greet them, his demeanor calm and professional. The questions came fast, probing everything from his experience in Bright Falls to his vision for the department. One reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes, asked, "Chief Anderson, there's been a lot of speculation about the culture of law enforcement here. Do you believe the department needs reform?" Jack met her gaze, his tone firm but diplomatic. "I believe every department has room for growth, and that includes us. Law enforcement should be about trust, accountability, and fairness for all residents. I'm here to make sure that Bright Falls Police embodies those values." The reporters continued their questions, and Jack answered each one with poise. By the end of the interview, he'd made it clear that change was not only coming but was already underway. Ethan and Ron's response was swift. The following day, they confronted Jack in his office, their faces dark with anger. Jack could see the strain in their expressions, the realization that their power was slipping from their grasp. Ethan shut the door behind him, his jaw clenched. "Chief, we need to talk." Jack leaned back in his chair, gesturing for them to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind, gentlemen?" Ron crossed his arms, his glare unwavering. "We've put years into this department, years of loyalty, and this is how you repay us." Jack's expression remained calm. "I'm here to make sure this department serves the community with integrity. I think that's something we can all support." Ethan's voice took on a threatening edge. "You think these people really want change? They like things the way they are, and they like us." Jack met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe some do, but others want to know they can trust the people who protect them, and that trust doesn't come from intimidation." The silence that followed was heavy, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Ethan forced a tight smile. "You don't know what you're messing with, Chief. This town has a way of dealing with people who think they can just change things." Jack stood, his voice steady. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I won't stop until this department is what it should be." Ethan and Ron exchanged a final look before storming out, leaving Jack alone in his office. He watched them go, a sense of finality settling over him. He knew the confrontation had been inevitable, and he was ready for whatever came next. Over the next few days, Jack made his move. He called a full department meeting, gathering the officers in the main hall. He held up a stack of papers, the documented complaints and evidence he'd been compiling, and laid it out on the table for everyone to see. "These are reports of misconduct," Jack announced, his voice carrying through the hall. "Incidents that went unaddressed, that undermined the trust this town has in us. Starting today, that ends. This department will operate with transparency and respect." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over the team. Jack could see the discomfort on some faces, but also the relief on others. He knew the message was sinking in. As he dismissed the meeting, he felt the first true signs of change taking root. The department was beginning to shift, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the old ways gave way to something new. The interview Jack had given to the reporters had made an impact. Within hours, clips from his statements were circulating online, reaching not only the town's residents, but also the surrounding counties. The response was swift and powerful. Comments flooded in, a mix of support and skepticism, but the majority were messages of encouragement for a police department that held its officers accountable. But while many people appreciated Jack's approach, the video stirred anger among those loyal to the old ways. Jack's phone buzzed with texts from former colleagues, friends who had caught wind of the video, all offering their thoughts and support. Yet, not all responses were supportive. Anonymous numbers sent texts implying he was stepping on dangerous ground, warnings that made it clear Ethan and Ron weren't alone in their resistance. Jack wasn't surprised, but the pushback was still sobering. He'd seen this play out before, the resistance to change, the friction that surfaced when someone challenged an ingrained culture. And he knew that Bright Falls was on the brink of choosing between two paths, one rooted in fear and loyalty to the past, the other in integrity and accountability. By late afternoon, the town square had turned into an unplanned gathering spot for the townsfolk, all of whom had opinions to voice. Some stood by the old lamppost where Jack had once been humiliated. Others spoke in small groups, their whispers occasionally reaching Jack's ears as he walked by. He could feel their watchful eyes on him, some filled with newfound respect, others with distrust. But he walked with his head held high, determined not to let their reactions sway his course. As the days passed, Jack saw an unexpected shift in the way people interacted with him. Townsfolk who had previously avoided him now offered polite nods, some even murmuring words of thanks. It was clear that his quiet defiance was inspiring those who had long felt silenced. People were beginning to realize that change might be possible, that Bright Falls could become a place where they didn't have to live in fear of stepping out of line. In particular, Jack found himself receiving quiet support from unlikely sources. Local business owners like Marla, the bookstore owner he'd met early on, began reaching out. Marla invited him to a small community event at her store, a reading night meant to celebrate the town's history. Though the gathering wasn't overtly political, Jack could sense it was a subtle way of showing him that he wasn't alone, that some in the community valued the integrity he was working to uphold. At the reading, Marla pulled Jack aside. "Chief, I want you to know some of us, we're glad you're here," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "A lot of folks have been afraid to speak up, but since you arrived, I think they're beginning to find their courage." Jack nodded, touched by her words. "Thank you, Marla. I know change isn't easy, but I believe it's worth fighting for." As the reading continued, Jack saw others in the crowd give him supportive glances, subtle nods of respect. He could feel the quiet wave of support gathering momentum, and it bolstered his resolve. Inside the police department, however, things were far from settled. Ethan and Ron, though still technically part of the force, had begun subtly rallying their allies within the department. Jack could see the divisions forming, the subtle alliances that had gone unchallenged for years now being forced into the light. One afternoon, as Jack walked past the break room, he overheard Ethan talking to a group of younger officers. His voice was low, his words carefully chosen, but Jack could make out the disdain in his tone. "All I'm saying," Ethan murmured, "is that things used to be simpler here. Back before we had to worry about appearances. Everyone knew their place." One of the younger officers, clearly unsure but reluctant to disagree, nodded, his expression tense. Jack decided not to interrupt, instead allowing the officers to speak freely. He knew that monitoring these conversations would only create resentment. Instead, he filed away the information, carefully noting who seemed to support Ethan and who appeared uncomfortable. As he returned to his office, Jack couldn't ignore the reality that Ethan's influence had woven deep into the department's fabric. He would need a strategy to address it, one that wouldn't provoke open rebellion, but would signal that his leadership wasn't a temporary experiment. To counter Ethan's whisper campaign, Jack called a department-wide meeting. He planned it carefully, making sure to keep the tone positive and constructive while still emphasizing accountability and respect. He knew this would be a defining moment for the department, a chance for him to set clear expectations and communicate his vision openly. As the officers filed into the meeting room, Jack noticed the tense expressions on some faces. Ethan and Ron sat in the back, their body language defiant, while officers like Claire and a few others leaned forward, eager and attentive. Jack began with a brief overview of his experience, then shifted to his vision for the department. He spoke about the importance of trust, both within the force and with the community, and his commitment to a culture of integrity. "Bright Falls deserves a department it can be proud of," Jack said, his voice steady. "A department that treats every resident with respect. This isn't about forgetting our past. It's about building on it, honoring the legacy of this town by making sure every person feels safe." As he spoke, he could see some officers nodding in agreement, their expressions hopeful. But Ethan's gaze was sharp, skeptical. Jack could feel the undercurrent of resistance, the unspoken challenge in the air. But he didn't back down, meeting each officer's gaze with calm determination. "We have an opportunity to make a difference here," he continued. "I'm asking each of you to stand with me in making this a department we can all be proud of." As the meeting ended, Jack felt a small but significant shift. Several officers approached him afterward, expressing their support, while others left without a word, their faces unreadable. But Jack could sense that the seeds he'd planted were beginning to take root. As Jack left the station that evening, he found Ethan waiting for him outside, his posture rigid and his expression hard. It was clear that Ethan had no intention of backing down quietly. "Chief," he greeted, his tone cold. "A word." Jack met his gaze, his own expression calm. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Ethan's eyes were sharp, his voice edged with anger. "I've put years into this department, Anderson. Years of hard work, loyalty. And now you come in here, acting like you're some kind of hero." Jack held his ground, his voice steady. "I'm not here to be a hero, Ethan. I'm here to lead this department with integrity." Ethan's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "Integrity? This town doesn't care about integrity. They want someone who understands them, who knows how things work." Jack's tone hardened. "Things are changing, Ethan. Whether you like it or not, this department is going to reflect the values of the people it serves. That's not a threat, it's a promise." Ethan's eyes flashed, but he said nothing, his jaw clenched in frustration. Jack could see the struggle in his expression, the realization that his influence was slipping. After a tense silence, Ethan turned on his heel, walking away without another word. Jack watched him go, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over him. He knew this was far from over, but he also knew that he had taken a stand that wouldn't go unnoticed. A week later, Jack received word that an outside auditing agency had been called in by the state to review the department's practices. It was a routine process for departments under new leadership, but Jack sensed it had been expedited due to the recent attention on Bright Falls. The arrival of the auditors created a palpable tension within the station. Officers who had been loyal to Ethan and Ron grew visibly uneasy, while those who supported Jack seemed encouraged by the prospect of greater accountability. The audit would be thorough, examining everything from past arrests to handling of complaints. Jack knew this was his chance to expose the corruption he'd quietly been documenting. He scheduled a meeting with the auditors, providing them with the records he'd compiled since his arrival. The information painted a clear picture of a department that had been operating with its own rules, protected by years of silence and intimidation. The auditors worked swiftly, interviewing officers and reviewing files. Jack kept his interactions with them professional and direct, knowing this process would bring long overdue scrutiny to the patterns of misconduct that had gone unchecked. As the audit progressed, whispers of the investigation spread throughout Bright Falls. Townspeople who had once feared retaliation began to speak out, some quietly approaching Jack to share their experiences, others confiding in Sarah, who documented their stories with journalistic precision. Ethan and Ron's reputations began to crumble, their influence unraveling as the weight of their past actions came to light. People were no longer afraid to confront the officers who had once instilled fear. Jack could see the change in the community, a sense of hope that had been absent when he first arrived. The culmination of the audit would be a report presented to the town council, and Jack knew that the findings would likely shape the future of the department. He prepared himself for whatever came next, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction that he had done his part in bringing accountability to Bright Falls. The day the auditors released their preliminary findings to the town council, Bright Falls held its breath. Jack knew the report would validate the complaints he'd quietly gathered, exposing the years of unchecked misconduct that had tarnished the department's integrity. It was the moment he had been preparing for since he'd arrived. The council meeting was packed, with citizens crowding in to hear the results. The air was thick with anticipation, every seat taken and people standing along the walls. Mayor Price began by introducing the auditors, who presented their findings in clear, measured tones. They described instances of questionable practices and repeated patterns of intimidation, their language careful but firm. Jack could feel the weight of each word settling over the room, the townspeople hanging on every syllable. Ethan and Ron sat at the back, their faces stony. Jack glanced their way, catching the flicker of fear behind their hardened expressions. They were beginning to realize the depth of the situation, that this wasn't just a passing storm but a reckoning that would change Bright Falls for good. As the presentation concluded, Mayor Price addressed the council and the public, her tone serious. The findings of this audit are clear. Changes need to be made to ensure our police department operates with the highest standards of integrity. I believe Chief Anderson's leadership is essential to restoring trust between law enforcement and our community. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and Jack felt a quiet satisfaction. The public had heard the truth, and for the first time, they were no longer afraid to demand accountability. The next morning, Bright Falls buzzed with a renewed energy. The audit findings dominated conversations, and townsfolk gathered in cafes, stores, and on sidewalks to discuss the changes they hoped to see. It was as though a weight had lifted from the town, a collective release of years of tension and unspoken fears. Sarah Lewis wrote a front-page story in the local paper, detailing the council meeting and the auditor's findings. Her words were direct yet compassionate, capturing the town's sense of betrayal, but also its hope for renewal. She highlighted Jack's role in pushing for accountability, casting him as a force for positive change. Jack walked through town that day, noticing how people's reactions to him had shifted. Locals who'd once kept their distance now approached him, offering nods of gratitude, handshakes, and even quiet words of thanks. Marla from the bookstore waved him over as he passed, her expression warm. "Chief Anderson, I think you've done something this town has needed for a long time," she said, her voice full of appreciation. "People are finally feeling safe, not just from outside threats, but from what was inside, too." Jack nodded, humbled. "Thank you, Marla. Change isn't easy, but seeing people feel safe, that's worth it." He knew there was still work to be done, but the support of the community felt like a victory in itself. Bright Falls was beginning to trust its police force again, and Jack felt the weight of that trust as both an honor and a responsibility. A few days later, a group of residents organized a peaceful march through the town square, calling for continued accountability in the police department. They carried signs with messages like "Transparency Matters" and "Justice for All." The march was quiet, respectful, but powerful, a visible reminder that the town supported Jack's reforms. Jack watched from a distance, a mix of pride and gratitude swelling within him. He knew that the residents who marched were taking a stand, not just for themselves, but for future generations who deserved to grow up in a place where they felt safe and respected. The march ended with a gathering in front of the police station, where Sarah Lewis addressed the crowd. She spoke passionately about the importance of honesty in leadership, of creating a community where every voice mattered. As she spoke, Jack stood at the station's entrance, his presence a quiet but resolute endorsement of everything she was saying. When Sarah finished, the crowd applauded, a wave of approval that felt like a promise. Bright Falls was ready to support Jack's vision for change. Back at the police station, Jack held a department meeting to discuss the next steps following the audit. The tension was palpable. Officers who had been close to Ethan and Ron seemed wary, uncertain of their futures, while those who had supported Jack felt a sense of relief. Jack addressed the team with his usual calm but firm demeanor. "The audit highlighted areas where we can improve, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Our job is to serve and protect this community, and that means every person deserves our respect and fair treatment. We're starting fresh, together." He outlined new protocols for transparency and ethics, measures designed to hold each officer accountable while also building trust within the team. He opened the floor to questions, encouraging officers to speak openly about their concerns. A few voiced worries about how the community now perceived them, fearful that past mistakes would overshadow their attempts to do better. Jack listened carefully, acknowledging their concerns. "This isn't about punishing anyone unfairly," he reassured them. "It's about making sure we're all moving forward in the right direction. We're here to protect each other, to protect this town. Let's show Bright Falls that they can rely on us." The meeting ended on a hopeful note, and as the officers filed out, Jack saw renewed resolve in their faces. They were ready to build something better, to leave the past behind and become the department their town needed. As the audit findings circulated through the community, pressure mounted for the department to take definitive action against Ethan and Ron. The town council, recognizing the need to address public concerns, held a closed-door session with Jack to discuss the future of the two officers. Inside the council chambers, Jack presented the evidence he had collected, detailing the patterns of intimidation and misconduct that had eroded trust within the community. He spoke plainly, letting the facts speak for themselves, and when he finished, the council members sat in silence, their expressions grave. Mayor Price finally spoke, her tone resolute. "Chief Anderson, we support your recommendation. Effective immediately, Officers Ethan Miller and Ron Jacobs are suspended, pending further investigation." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. He knew that removing them from the force would send a powerful message, but he also knew it was only the beginning of a longer journey toward healing. Later that evening, Jack called a private meeting with Ethan and Ron to inform them of the council's decision. The two men arrived with defiant expressions, their postures tense. "Chief," Ethan said, his voice dripping with contempt, "you really think this is going to change anything? You're just one man." Jack met his gaze calmly. "Maybe I am just one man, but this town deserves better, and they're ready for it. The people of Bright Falls want accountability, and that's exactly what they're going to get." Ethan and Ron stared at him, their bravado cracking under the weight of his words. They had lost, and Jack's unwavering resolve left no room for doubt. In the weeks following Ethan and Ron's suspension, the mood in Bright Falls transformed. Residents felt a renewed sense of ownership in their community, a willingness to engage with the police department in constructive ways. Jack organized monthly community meetings, encouraging open dialogue between officers and residents. The meetings were initially met with caution, but as trust built, people began to share their stories and concerns. Jack listened carefully to each voice, from longtime residents to newer families, making notes and pledging to address their issues wherever possible. He could feel the community healing, one meeting at a time, and he knew that his efforts were making a lasting impact. Local organizations began partnering with the police department on initiatives that promoted safety and cooperation. Marla's bookstore hosted workshops on community safety, while the local church organized volunteer events that brought together officers and residents. The town was no longer divided between those in power and those who feared it. They were slowly becoming a community united by shared values and mutual respect. Months passed, and Bright Falls settled into a rhythm of positive change. Jack's department had implemented new training programs, updated protocols, and developed community outreach programs that kept residents informed and involved. The culture of fear that had once permeated the town was steadily replaced by a culture of cooperation and trust. Jack walked through the town one evening, feeling the quiet pride that came with knowing he had played a role in creating something meaningful. The lamppost where he'd once been humiliated stood as a silent reminder of how far the town had come. Now, as he passed it, he saw it not as a symbol of his humiliation, but as a marker of transformation, a point of change that had led to a better future. At the end of his walk, Jack stopped by Marla's bookstore, where she was hosting a town event celebrating community milestones. Sarah was there, along with other familiar faces who had supported him from the beginning. Jack felt a sense of peace as he looked around, grateful for the journey that had brought them all together. As the evening continued, Jack reflected on the challenges he'd faced, the battles fought, and the resilience shown. Bright Falls had become a place of integrity, a town where every resident had a voice. And as he stood among his friends and colleagues, he knew this was only the beginning of a new era, one they'd build together, one day at a time. As news of Ethan and Ron's suspension circulated, Bright Falls seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. People began to share stories that had once been whispered behind closed doors, stories of encounters with the two officers that had left residents feeling small, threatened, or humiliated. The town was finally confronting a truth it had buried for too long. Jack could feel the weight of these stories every time he spoke with someone in town. People approached him in grocery stores, on the sidewalks, and even outside the police station. Some thanked him in hushed tones. Others shared accounts of past incidents that made Jack's stomach tighten. Yet, each story strengthened his resolve to continue the transformation he'd set in motion. One afternoon, Jack received a visit from an elderly woman named Mrs. Dempsey, who was well known in Bright Falls for her decades of work as a local teacher. She shuffled into the station, her frail hands clutching a small, worn notebook. Jack greeted her warmly, offering her a seat in his office. "Chief Anderson," she began, her voice wavering. "I'm here because I've seen what you're doing, and I thought it was time I spoke up." She opened the notebook, revealing a series of neatly written accounts detailing incidents she'd witnessed over the years, minor abuses of power, moments where Ethan and Ron had crossed lines, all written in careful detail. Her words were precise, almost clinical, as she recounted the stories, but Jack could sense the pain beneath her calm demeanor. "They used to scare people, you know," she said softly. "People were afraid to speak up because they didn't want to make enemies. But I see now that silence, it does more harm than good." Jack listened, moved by her courage. "Thank you, Mrs. Dempsey," he said, his voice filled with respect. "This is exactly what we need to make things right." As she left, Jack realized that her bravery represented the heart of what was happening in Bright Falls. People were finally shedding the fear that had kept them silent, allowing truth and honesty to fill the spaces where intimidation had once thrived. With Ethan and Ron suspended, the department operated with a sense of unity that had been missing since Jack's arrival. Officers who had once seemed skeptical now approached their duties with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to prove to the town that they could be trusted. Jack encouraged this spirit, holding weekly meetings to discuss ways they could engage more positively with the community. In the following weeks, Jack organized community safety days, events held at the town's park where officers gave talks on safety, invited children to tour the patrol cars, and encouraged residents to ask questions. These gatherings became an unexpected success, attracting families, seniors, and young people alike. For the first time in years, the police were seen not as distant enforcers but as friends and protectors, partners in building a safer community. At one of these events, a young boy named Eli approached Jack, clutching a homemade thank you card. The boy's mother explained that Eli had once been afraid of police officers, but Jack's presence had changed that. "Thank you, Chief Anderson," the boy said shyly, handing over the card. Jack crouched down, accepting it with a warm smile. "Thank you, Eli. I'm glad I could help," Jack replied, feeling a wave of gratitude that his efforts were making a difference, even for the youngest residents. These events became a cornerstone of Jack's vision for the department, building trust, one conversation, one handshake, one small gesture at a time. Eventually, the town council reconvened to make a final decision regarding Ethan and Ron's employment. Jack was present for the meeting, joined by Mayor Price and a few other officials who had been monitoring the case closely. The council members reviewed the audit's findings one last time, carefully considering the impact that Ethan and Ron's behavior had had on the community. After hours of discussion, the council reached a decision. Ethan and Ron's employment with the Bright Falls Police Department would be officially terminated. Jack felt a quiet sense of resolution as he heard the decision. It wasn't a victory he celebrated openly, but he knew it was necessary for the town's healing. The weight of accountability had finally settled, and with it, the door to a new chapter for Bright Falls opened wider. Word of the council's decision spread quickly, and the town's reaction was immediate. Residents spoke openly about their relief, and Jack noticed the difference it made in everyday interactions. People walked taller, spoke louder, and moved through town with a renewed sense of security. The fear that had once shrouded Bright Falls was slowly lifting, replaced by a cautious but growing trust. With the old guard gone, Jack focused on cementing the department's new foundation. He held training sessions that emphasized empathy and accountability, bringing in guest speakers from neighboring towns to discuss best practices and methods for building positive relationships with the community. Officers were encouraged to participate in discussions, to share their thoughts and experiences, and to ask questions without fear of judgment. Jack also implemented a system for reviewing citizen complaints, ensuring that every issue was documented, investigated, and resolved transparently. He made it clear that there would be no tolerance for abuses of power or unchecked authority. Each officer knew they were held to a higher standard now, and Jack's clear, consistent expectations helped them feel confident in this new direction. As these changes took root, Jack could see the difference in his team. Officers who had once been hesitant now embraced their roles with a sense of pride. They understood that their job wasn't just about enforcing laws, but about serving the people of Bright Falls with integrity and respect. One day, Claire Thompson, one of the younger officers, approached Jack after a training session. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I think we all feel like we're part of something meaningful now." Jack gave her a nod, feeling a swell of pride. "Thank you, Claire. It's all of us, together, that make this possible." As summer faded into autumn, Bright Falls settled into its new rhythm. Jack walked through town one crisp morning, admiring the changing leaves and the quiet beauty of the place he now called home. The atmosphere was different than when he had arrived. It felt lighter, as though the town itself had been renewed. In the weeks following Ethan and Ron's termination, Jack had worked tirelessly to ensure that their departure left no lingering resentment within the department. He'd held private meetings with officers who had been close to them, offering them support and a clear path forward. He wanted them to understand that while change was difficult, it was also an opportunity to build something better. Jack's careful leadership paid off. The department ran smoothly, its officers working with a sense of purpose and unity. The positive feedback from the community reinforced their resolve, reminding them that they were part of something larger than themselves. The new culture Jack had cultivated within the department extended beyond the walls of the station. Local businesses, schools, and even neighborhood associations began to partner with the police, organizing events and initiatives that promoted community well-being. Bright Falls was no longer a place where people whispered in fear. It was a town where people spoke freely, confident in their voices. As the first snowfall dusted Bright Falls, Jack found himself reflecting on his journey. He hadn't expected his role as chief to be easy, but he'd also never anticipated the depth of the community's transformation. What had started as a struggle against corruption had become a movement towards something far greater, a renewed sense of belonging, a shared commitment to justice, and an enduring belief in the power of community. One evening, as Jack was closing up at the station, Sarah Lewis stopped by with a basket of homemade cookies. She gave him a warm smile, her eyes reflecting the gratitude of the town. "I just wanted to say thank you, Chief," she said, handing him the basket, "for what you've done. I know you've changed things here for good." Jack took the basket, feeling a wave of appreciation. "Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done it without people like you standing up with me." As they stood in the quiet of the station, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. Bright Falls was a place he was proud to serve, a town where people worked together to make life better for one another. And though the journey had been challenging, he knew it had been worth every moment. He walked Sarah to the door, watching as she disappeared into the snowy night, the lights of Bright Falls twinkling around her. The town had changed, and so had he. Jack locked the door, feeling the weight of his badge with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready for them. Bright Falls was his town now, and he would continue to protect it with everything he had. Winter set in, blanketing Bright Falls in a soft, peaceful quiet. The town had transformed over the past few months, shedding old fears and embracing new hope. Jack Anderson walked through the town square one crisp morning, watching as people went about their routines with a sense of calm he hadn't seen when he'd first arrived. Bright Falls, once divided by a culture of intimidation, now thrived under a sense of community and mutual respect. Jack's changes to the department had taken hold. Officers worked with a sense of pride and dedication that went beyond duty. They felt connected to the people they served. Jack had established regular feedback sessions, where officers could voice concerns and suggest improvements. These meetings had become a cornerstone of his leadership, a forum for honest, constructive conversation that ensured everyone felt valued. One afternoon, as he reviewed recent community feedback, Jack received a visit from Claire Thompson, one of his most dedicated officers. She entered his office, a tentative smile on her face. "Chief," she said, "I just wanted to tell you, I've been hearing things around town. Good things. People feel safe again, and they're grateful for you, for all of us." Jack nodded, feeling a swell of pride. "Thank you, Claire. It's all of us working together that makes this possible." She smiled, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I feel lucky to be part of this, to be part of a department that cares." As she left, Jack reflected on how far the department had come. They'd gone from a fractured group, held together by silence, to a team committed to integrity and service. It was a legacy Jack knew would endure, a foundation for future generations to build upon. One evening, Jack was invited to speak at a town event hosted by Marla at her bookstore. The event, titled Stories of Bright Falls, aimed to celebrate the town's history while honoring the changes that had brought about its renewed spirit. Jack arrived to find the bookstore packed, with people of all ages gathered to share stories, reminisce, and celebrate their community. Marla introduced him with a warm smile. "Tonight, we have someone very special with us. Chief Jack Anderson has not only led our police department, but he's also helped us find our way back to each other." Jack stepped up to the front of the room, looking out at the familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and townspeople who had welcomed him and stood by him. He felt a surge of appreciation for this place and its people. "I came to Bright Falls for a fresh start," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't know then that this town would teach me as much as I'd hoped to give. Change isn't easy, but I've seen the courage in each of you to make it happen. This is a community that values justice, that lifts each other up, and that's what makes Bright Falls truly special." The crowd applauded, some people even wiping away tears. As he stepped down, Jack felt the support of the town envelop him like a warm embrace. Bright Falls had become a place where every resident mattered, a town united by shared goals and mutual respect. Over the next few months, Jack's focus shifted to ensuring the department's values would continue to thrive long after his tenure. He established a mentorship program within the department, pairing senior officers with younger recruits. The goal was not only to pass down skills, but to instill the culture of integrity and service that had become Bright Falls Police Department's new standard. Jack himself mentored Claire Thompson, recognizing her dedication and potential as a future leader. They spent time discussing not only police work, but also the qualities that made a strong leader: empathy, patience, and the courage to stand up for what's right. One day, during a quiet moment, Claire voiced something she'd been holding back. "Chief, I think I'd like to follow in your footsteps. Not just in this department, but as a leader, someone people can count on." Jack felt a swell of pride and gave her an encouraging nod. "You'd be an excellent leader, Claire. Remember, leadership isn't about control. It's about trust, and you've earned that trust from this town." Claire's eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, Chief. I hope one day I'll be able to give back as much as you have." As she left his office, Jack realized that the legacy he'd leave in Bright Falls wasn't just in the policies or procedures he'd implemented. It was in the people he'd empowered, in the trust he'd rebuilt, and in the way the town had embraced a culture of respect and compassion. The following spring, the town organized an anniversary celebration to mark the changes and achievements of the past year. It was a community-wide event with games for kids, food vendors, and a makeshift stage set up in the town square. The atmosphere was festive, filled with laughter and music, a far cry from the tense gatherings that had once dominated Bright Falls. Jack walked through the square, greeted by smiles and waves from the townspeople. Parents introduced him to their children, business owners offered him samples of their best dishes, and elderly residents thanked him for all he'd done. The weight of these gestures moved him deeply. Marla, Sarah, and Claire joined him at the edge of the square, each of them expressing their gratitude for his role in transforming the town. Sarah leaned over, giving him a warm smile. "I hope you know you've changed all of our lives, Jack." Jack chuckled, touched by her words. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone working together." As the sun set, the mayor took to the stage, inviting Jack up to say a few words. He stepped forward, looking out at the crowd, feeling a wave of pride and humility. "When I came to Bright Falls, I didn't expect to find a home," he began, his voice steady. "But that's exactly what this town has become. Bright Falls has shown me the power of community, of resilience, and of standing up for what's right. I'm honored to be a part of this story, and I know that together, we're building a future we can all be proud of. The applause was thunderous, and as Jack stepped down, he knew he'd made a difference not just as a police chief, but as a member of a community he had come to love deeply. As the anniversary celebration wound down and people began to leave, Jack stayed back, taking one last walk through the town square under the glow of the streetlights. The square looked peaceful, with the remnants of the day's festivities scattered across the grass, a few forgotten balloons, empty paper cups, and the faint scent of popcorn lingering in the air. He reached the lamppost where he'd once been tied, a symbol that had once marked his humiliation but now represented the town's transformation. Standing there, he felt a sense of closure, as if the past had been fully laid to rest, and Bright Falls had truly moved forward. Jack knew that his work wasn't done. There would always be new challenges, new tests of the community's resilience. But he felt ready, confident in the strength of the people he'd come to know. Bright Falls had become a place of integrity, a place where each resident's voice mattered, and he was proud to call it home. A few months later, Jack gathered his department for a meeting, one that marked the beginning of a new era. He announced that he would be stepping down from his position in the coming year, but that he'd stay on as a consultant to help the transition to new leadership. Claire, who had grown into a role with poise and dedication, would be promoted to assistant chief, with the potential to succeed him officially. Jack's announcement was met with bittersweet smiles, but he could see the pride in his officers' faces. They were ready, and he was leaving the department in capable hands. After the meeting, Claire approached him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Chief, thank you for believing in me. I won't let you down." Jack gave her a warm smile, his voice filled with conviction. "I know you won't, Claire. This department and this town are in good hands." As he walked out of the station that evening, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. Bright Falls would continue to thrive, not because of him alone, but because of the people who had come together to create something lasting. He had found a home here, and he was content knowing that his legacy would live on through the values he'd instilled. The town of Bright Falls had come a long way, and so had he. And as he looked out over the peaceful streets, he knew the future held endless possibilities. As spring blossomed in Bright Falls, the town seemed to be alive with renewed energy. Flowers lined Main Street, the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery, and shop windows sparkled in the sunlight. Jack felt pride each time he walked through town, greeted by warm nods and waves from townspeople who had come to see him not just as the police chief, but as a friend and neighbor. The positive changes had extended beyond the department. Jack noticed that local businesses were thriving. Community events were more frequent, and neighbors were pitching in to help each other in ways he hadn't seen when he'd first arrived. Bright Falls had developed a sense of unity, a commitment to mutual respect, and an openness that had been absent in the days of quiet intimidation. One Saturday morning, Jack attended a town cleanup event, where volunteers gathered to clear debris from a nearby creek. He worked alongside townsfolk of all ages, from teenagers eager to help to older residents sharing stories of the town's history. Marla, the bookstore owner, joined him, her face glowing with pride. "You've done something amazing here, Jack," she said as they worked. "It's not just the department. It's the way people are connecting. You've brought us together in a way I didn't think was possible." Jack smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. Bright Falls had all of this in it already, Marla. People just needed a reason to believe in each other again. She nodded, patting his shoulder with a friendly smile. "Well, you were that reason, whether you like it or not." As he glanced around, seeing neighbors chatting and children playing nearby, Jack knew she was right. He'd only helped bring out what was already their shared commitment to building a town that everyone could be proud of. Jack decided to host an open house at the police station, inviting townspeople to tour the facilities, meet the officers, and participate in safety workshops. It was an opportunity to further break down barriers and demonstrate that the department was committed to transparency and service. The event was a success, with families coming through in waves. Officers gave kids tours of the patrol cars, showing them how the lights and radios worked. The young ones giggled and posed for pictures with the officers, thrilled by the excitement of the day. Jack led a session on community safety, answering questions about everything from personal safety tips to emergency preparedness. One woman approached Jack at the end of the day, her face lit up with gratitude. She introduced herself as Maria Alvarez, a local schoolteacher who had moved to Bright Falls a few years ago. "Chief Anderson, I just wanted to say thank you," she said, shaking his hand. "My students feel safer because of the work you've done. You've changed the way they see the police." Her words touched him deeply, and he thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The event had shown him that his work had a lasting impact on the youngest generation, a gift he knew they would carry forward into their own lives. Jack's transition plan continued, with a particular focus on grooming Claire Thompson for her eventual role as department leader. She was attentive and dedicated, showing a genuine passion for the work and a strong commitment to the town. Jack worked with her closely, teaching her not only the mechanics of police work, but also the nuances of leadership, how to handle difficult conversations, how to inspire others, and how to build trust within a team. One afternoon, Jack sat down with Claire in his office, handing her a journal filled with his notes and observations on leadership, community building, and integrity. "Consider this a guide," he said with a smile. "Lessons I've learned over the years. Take from what feels right to you and make it your own." Claire took the journal, her eyes shining with appreciation. "Thank you, Chief. I promise I'll honor everything you've built here." Jack gave her an encouraging nod. "You'll do more than that, Claire. I know you'll make this department even better." Their mentorship sessions became a cornerstone of Jack's final months as chief. He watched with pride as Claire grew in confidence, her own leadership style emerging with each decision she made. By the time Jack stepped back from active duty, he felt secure in the knowledge that the department was in capable hands. With his formal duties winding down, Jack began spending more time in the community, attending town meetings, local fairs, and neighborhood gatherings. He made it a point to stay accessible, offering advice where needed and encouraging people to stay engaged with the police department. One evening, he was invited to a storytelling night at Marla's bookstore, where townspeople gathered to share tales from Bright Falls past. Jack listened as residents told stories of their grandparents, of founding families, of traditions both sweet and silly. He could see that Bright Falls had a deep-rooted pride in its history, a pride that was now mixed with a hope for the future. When it was Jack's turn to share, he spoke briefly about his journey in the town, about the challenges he'd faced, and the strength he'd found in the people who had rallied around him. "This town has shown me what community is truly about," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's not about one person. It's about all of us working together. Thank you, Bright Falls, for showing me the meaning of home." The room erupted in applause, and Jack felt a profound sense of closure. Bright Falls had become his family, and he knew his legacy would live on in the people who now carried forward the values he had helped to cultivate. The time came for Jack's official retirement ceremony, held at the town square on a warm spring day. Townspeople filled the square, many holding signs of gratitude, while officers from the department lined up to honor their chief. Mayor Price took to the stage, her voice full of respect and admiration. "Chief Anderson has led our town through one of its most transformative times. His dedication to justice, his kindness, and his strength have shaped us in ways we'll never forget. Today, we say goodbye to a leader, but we know his spirit will always be with us." Jack stepped forward, his heart full as he looked out over the crowd. He kept his words brief but heartfelt, thanking everyone for their support, their courage, and their willingness to embrace change. "I may be stepping down," he said, "but this town is in your hands now. Keep the light of integrity alive. Make Bright Falls a place where everyone feels safe and respected. And remember, I'll always be a part of this community." As he left the stage, people crowded around him, shaking his hand, thanking him, and expressing their gratitude. Children gave him handmade cards, business owners offered him free coffee for life, and townsfolk hugged him with tears in their eyes. Jack felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he'd made a lasting difference. A few weeks later, Jack returned to the station one last time to clear out his office. Claire was waiting for him, her face a mixture of excitement and sadness. They shared a quiet moment, each reflecting on the journey they had taken together. "Thank you, Chief," Claire said softly, "for everything. I'll carry on what you started here." Jack gave her a final nod of encouragement. "You'll do great, Claire. Bright Falls is lucky to have you." With a final handshake, Jack left the station, feeling lighter than he had in years. He walked through town, stopping by familiar spots, reflecting on the moments that had shaped his time here. He knew he would remain a part of this town's story, woven into its fabric by the trust he had built and the changes he had championed. Jack settled into a quieter life in Bright Falls, enjoying his retirement, but staying involved in the community he loved. He volunteered at the library, helped organize town events, and occasionally offered advice to Claire and her team. He had become a beloved figure, not just for his service as chief, but for the person he had become: a steady presence, a mentor, a friend. One warm evening, Jack sat on a bench in the town square, watching as families strolled by, children played, and friends gathered to chat. The town was peaceful, the sky streaked with the colors of sunset. As he sat there, content, Marla joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "Feels like everything turned out exactly as it was meant to, don't you think?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Jack nodded, a satisfied smile on his face. "Yeah, I think it did." They sat in companionable silence, watching as the town they loved continued to grow and thrive. Jack felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had found a home here, not just in a place, but in the hearts of the people he had come to cherish. Thank you for joining me on Jack's journey through Bright Falls in the Last Watch. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, community, and transformation, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more immersive stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. There are plenty more tales of courage and redemption coming your way. Subscribe now and join our community. Let's keep building stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power of integrity and connection. See you in the next chapter.